kind of things. It was really bad. Please go on, Nicholas. So the blackface incident this year is I mean, how can we find solutions? How do we search for solutions to this? The blackface incident this year is one of impunity, in my opinion. It is not just ignorance, if you ask me. I mean, racists all over the world are known to always play ignorance and innocence. If you genuinely make a mistake about acting and Africans say they don't like it, you recruit African actors. You don't do it again. It is impunity. In 2017, Antoine Griezmann, who is a football player, soccer player, who is not known to be racist to his people, to other people, to his fellow black players, he made a mistake on acting this blackface, and he was criticized, and he apologized for it. The Beijing actors did blackface in 2018, and they were soundly criticized. Doing it again is impunity, and it does not celebrate, black skin. It should have apologized and stop doing it. Can we go on? Yeah. So in conclusion, various governmental and non-governmental groups must, work towards achieving the following: 1, stop the blackface incidents and find African actors. Admit to the race problem in China and promulgate policies against racism, not just only against and not just only anti-black racism, but all kinds of racism in China, and to enact laws that punish acts of racism, to compensate victims of racism. Racism defined in any way, it is always, it has victims, people who suffer from it. So racism is an impediment to the improvement of people, or people-to-people engagement as an important aspect of the relation between Africa and China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bodomo. Thanks for this, very relevant presentation. So I'm going to pass on the word to Professor Castillo, who will discuss some ideas on moving beyond the more traditional or binary conceptions of race in the contemporary context. Professor Castillo.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nicholas, for the invite. It's my pleasure to be here. Also, thanks to Oxford University China Africa Network for supporting this event. As said earlier, it is definitely my pleasure to be here today, sharing the screens, not necessarily the room, sharing the screens with the pioneer of research on Africans in China, Professor Adams Bodomo, and with a scholar that has been definitely very influential in my work because of all the things that she has produced, which is very prolific, Professor Shanshan. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Now I'm going to try to be brief and stay within time. What I planned is just to make a number of statements that relate to some of the questions that Nicholas posed in his framing of this event. And then obviously try to have a conversation with the other speakers and with the audience a little bit later. So most of the things that I'm going to be talking about in these brief opening remarks come from an article that I wrote in 2020 titled Race and Racism in Contemporary Africa-China Relations Research: Approaches, Controversies, and Reflections. But before starting, I'd like to emphasize my appreciation for the title of this conversation, although Nicholas framed it more like as a debate. But the title, I believe, is quite important because the title of this gathering today is Racialized Encounters in Contemporary China. And I believe that all too often people seem to jump right away into the race and racism discussion without much interest into looking at the processes of racialization that operate through notions like race, racism, and other forms of racial thought. And this is an important idea that I want to emphasize: other forms of racial thought. Talking in particular about racism, Jamie Monson, a prominent historian of Afro-Chinese encounters who works at Michigan State University in the United States, suggests that racism is only one of many possible forms of racial thought, although a very bad one if you want, right? But one, right? One form of racial thought. She argues that a focus on racism as incident, paying attention to the incidents that we find in media, rather than on racialization as a process, may obscure the ways in which racial thinking informs historical constructions of identity, both in Africa and in China. So what she does through her work is encouraging scholars of identity, like some of us in the room, to think through the processes of racialization through which individuals, communities, and nations construct and deploy their discourses of sameness and difference. And I believe that that's very relevant for contemporary China. I also believe that looking at processes of racialization in Africa-China relations not only points to the need to historicize the ways in which racial identities have been constructed in colonial and post-colonial settings, but also, and perhaps more crucially, to understand these processes as contextual, situational, contingent, and inherently unstable. Now, that was about racism, right? Now, talking in particular about racialization, because I believe these words matter, right? Now, this notion, racialization, needs to be understood as a multi-layered one. As a category, racialization encapsulates multiple phenomena encompassing face-to-face exchanges, media narratives, scholarly knowledge production, I don't know, whatnot, right? So no, racialization is not just another way of talking about racism. It is indeed a complex, multi-layered phenomena that has an impact on the experiences of people. And while to me, the experiences of people are the most important, we also need to look at these other layers to try to understand why what happens, right? So I also appreciate the framing of this event today, because as I was reading through the questions that were posed in the pamphlet, and I chose some of these questions carefully to try to address some of the issues raised on those questions. But I also noted that whomever, I think it's Nicholas or the network who framed this event, were carefully to highlight that when we talk about racialization and also race and racism in China, we are not merely uniquely talking about Africans in China, right? Although obviously we're specialists on that topic, right? Indeed, nowhere throughout the framing of this event is there an emphasis on the experiences of Black people in China, right? In the questions that were posed. I don't know if that was intention, but at least it's not there, which I'm very happy with. What is there, it seems to be a more comprehensive gaze to try to understand how China is dealing with otherness in these days, internally and externally, right? Now, these are, without a doubt, complex issues in these very difficult times. So thank you very much for that. Now, the questions that I chose to address very quickly, because I only have 4 or 5 more minutes. One of the questions was talking about China is not immune to race-related questions as attested by some of the recent high-profile episodes. Professor Bodomo already spoke about some of these events. I believe, though, that we will see more of these things coming, that it is very difficult, and it will be very difficult given the situation, the geopolitical environment where we're living and where China is enmeshed with all these externalities. I think that it will be very difficult for these events to disappear. With the increasing tensions that are emerging in China in relation to Chinese racial nationalism and the Cold War that we're living through globally, I believe that the sparks of racial nationalism in China are going to turn into a fire, right? Are already on fire, right? Everywhere in the world, but in talking today about China. Now, so I will talk more about that. I think we could discuss this kind of question that you posed, Nicholas, in your questions later with the audience or my colleagues here. One other element that I found very, very relevant in this discussion today is the connection that you made between geopolitics and racial issues. And that is very relevant to what is happening in these days. We are witnessing the writing of a powerful China into the story of global politics. And this is quite complex to understand geopolitically. In my most recent work, which is still unpublished, I've been trying to look at the cultural politics of racialized and gendered representations in Africa-China related mediascapes from the perspective of something that is called popular geopolitics. Now, I won't define that, don't get scared. I don't have time to do that. But I'm looking at popular geopolitics of Africa-China encounter, right? Now, geopolitical analysis has been performed in political science and international relations research about Africa-China issues. Some other people have worked on that, but has been remarkably overlooked as a methodological tool to make sense of the cultural politics of Afro-Chinese racialized politics and narratives and their implications. So what I'm trying to do, and that's why I believe this discussion is very relevant, by focusing on a number of recent controversial incidents, like what Professor Bodomo was talking about, and also the Xiaobi ad that we all saw in 2018, when the guy was put in the washing machine, and a few other things. I'm trying to sort of argue that in this day and age, these events are kind of weaving new and old racist tropes and gender stereotypes into evolving processes of racialization that inform Africa-China relations, geopolitical imaginaries. What I'm trying to get at, and I believe I'm in that direction, is I believe that there is enough evidence to claim that within these processes of racialization, there is a pattern where Chinese is discursively constructed as a replacement for whiteness. And I can talk more about that, like China is taking the place of whiteness somehow. I will talk more about that later now. So that is in relation to geopolitics, very fascinating. I'm running short on time. So the last thing I want to talk about is quickly two things. You ask, what role does race play in the interactions between China-based foreign communities and their Chinese hosts? I believe that this is not a story of two groups, Chinese and Africans, right? Or Chinese and foreigners. It's quite complex. I believe that Professor Shanshan has done a lot of work in relation to trying to bring nuance to the different identities that you can find in these exchanges. On the African side, multiple identities, but also on the Chinese side, when we talk about ethnic minorities in China. And the last thing I want to, and I may extend 1 or 2 minutes, the last thing that I want to address here is the last question in the framing for this event was how to make sense of the racialized encounters without falling into the trap of inappropriately projecting Western-derived concepts, while also accounting for the continued centrality of the West in global discourses of race. This is, for me, the most important point. So bear with me, it's just 1 more minute. Now, I believe that this is very, very critical. It is 2021, and research on race and racism and racialization in Africa-China relations continues to underperform and is fraught with methodological issues and challenges. I mean, we have people in the room that have done a lot of work, but in generally speaking, there are still a lot of issues and challenges. One of the most problematic issues that I've been really struggling with and been, problematizing is still the direct untranslated importation and imposition of Western, mostly American ideas and labels to analyze and describe the Afro-Chinese racial encounter. Professor Chua Ben Huat from Singapore National University notes that, quote, scholars in Asia who are trained in the Euro-American academies pluck ready-made concepts from existing literature generated in the later context and apply them to local conditions in Asia, end of quote. Take, for instance, recent media and scholarly narratives around Africans in China that put forward notions like Afrophobia or even anti-Black racism. As noted earlier, these notions are heavy with historic resonances in different contexts, not only in the United States, but in many other post-colonial societies. Now, these narratives are problematic not only because all they do is identify a local version of a Western form. It's a little bit when they say that WeChat is China's Twitter, right? Identifying a local version of a Western form. But more importantly, because their articulation runs the risk of equating the experiences of Black people in China with the institutionalized violences against people of color and indigenous people in other parts of the world, historically speaking. Now, the last line. Doubtlessly, it is important to try to situate discussions of race and racism in Africa-China relations more broadly in the field of global race studies, without a doubt. However, I believe that using loaded terms to represent what takes place on the ground, effectively erasing important distinctions between how Blackness, for instance, is constructed and, more importantly, experienced in Chinese and Western settings, may not only be irresponsible, but also ethically compromising. Exclusively relying on these imported terms to describe African presence in China reinforces a Western hegemonic and racialized perspective and tradition in representing African diasporic communities. Without a doubt, this is, I believe, a methodological issue and a challenge to overcome in contemporary Africa-China race research. Apologies for the 3 extra minutes.
No problem. Thanks a lot, Professor Castillo. I'm glad you appreciated the framing of the event. And I cannot stress enough how I agree on the need to go beyond North American-centric conceptions of racialization. So I think that the previous 2 panelists have mentioned a lot of points, and I don't expect Professor Lan to get onto all of them, but racism, the question of race in China is not just about Black people, although we, as a OUCAN, we're particularly interested in them. But it's a generalized tendency, thought process, let's put it that way, which is not disappearing. So based on that, maybe Professor Lan, would be great if you could tell us, how your view, how racialization works in China, and some of the changes through which this process of racialization has been going through recently.
Thank you, Nicholas, for having me here. Let me share my PowerPoint. Okay, my presentation consists of, let's see, slideshow, 2 parts. How to play it from the beginning, okay. So the first part, I will answer your question. Is racism against Blacks in China the same as racism against Blacks in Western countries like the US? I think this follows up nicely with Roberto's comment about imposing the Western concept of race to the Chinese context. The second part, I review the evolution of the notion of race in the Chinese context until now, the COVID-19 crisis, okay? So it's a 2-part, but I hope it's coherent, okay? So to put it simply, my answer is racism in China is different from racism in the West, because you have to look at the difference between the Chinese gaze and the white gaze. As Roberto said, racialization is a process, right? It's mediated by specific historical and cultural contexts. The context of China is different from that in the US and Europe. In China, there's a tradition of externalization of race and racism. Right? It's the Americans who are the racists. We Chinese, we are victims of racism. How can we be racist? And the externalization of race and racism. And if you think of the Chinese historical context, you have the humiliation under Western power during the Qing dynasty, right? The Opium War, right? It's very different from the history in the US, like a history of slavery, anti-Black racism, structural racism against African Americans in the US. In China, people often think of the Mao period, right? Third World Alliance, the history of Sino-African friendship. This has been overemphasized by the Chinese government as official propaganda. Almost every Chinese knows it, right? So you have very different historical cultural context, right? Which impact the Chinese gaze and the white gaze. And the white gaze in the Western context, it's strictly based on the Black and white binary, right? Black people is constructed as inferior, racially inferior or dehumanized. But the Chinese context, we have to move beyond the black and white binary, right? Because in my article, I argue there is actually a triangulation. For Roberto, there are multiple triangulations, right? So you have Chinese, white, and black, right? The way Chinese look at black people is filtered through white perspective, right? The way Black people look at Chinese is also through the lens of Western racial ideology. So there is a racial triangulation. However, there's also the question, to what extent do some Chinese people internalize the white gaze? Because many of the Chinese graduate students, even now, right, they are educated in the West, in Oxford, like me, in the United States. How do Chinese people internalize the white gaze and apply it in their daily practices? So to continue with the specificity of race in China, we have to understand the meaning of foreignness. Instead of being categorized as white or black, a white person or a black person first, they are recognized as foreigners in China. That's the primary way of constructing difference in China is between Chinese and foreigners. If we must come with a binary, it's the binary between Chinese and foreigners. However, the meaning of foreigner is really elastic. I mean, it's it can expand, it can also contract. So within this foreigner category, it can refer to anyone who is not Chinese. But people from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau, because they look Chinese, right? They are still considered Chinese. But Koreans, Japanese, right? Westerners, Africans are all considered foreigners. But within this foreigner category, white people are the default foreigner. When we say, hey, yesterday I met a foreigner. So basically, I mean, yesterday I met a white person. If it's a black person, I would say, yesterday I met a Heiran, I met a black person. So it already shows that within the foreigner category, blackness is marked. It's marked. This resembles the situation in the Western countries, blackness as racialized as being marked. Right? But there are also tensions within the foreigner identity. On the one hand, all the foreigners, not just the white people, even black people, right? They enjoy privilege as foreigners because of the historical construction in the Mao era of foreigners being our distinguished guests. Right? They live in foreign-only hotels. Right? They use foreign exchange currency. So that kind of privilege still carry on today to some extent. But on the other hand, they also experience lots of precariousness because they are often constructed as cultural outsiders, right? Non-Chinese speaking, structurally marginalized in China's immigration policy, right? So this one, you have all kinds of various images and constructions of foreign friends, foreign experts, foreign talents. These are the foreign professionals. These are the more privileged. But you also have Sanfei foreigner, means triple illegal foreigner, and foreign trash. You also see the tension between privileges and precariousness. To further complicate the matter, we have not one unified Chinese gaze. We have multiple Chinese gazes. In my other article, I mentioned, I made a distinction between at least 3 different types of Chinese gaze. The gaze from the Chinese state, which is highly politicized, which only emphasize Sino-African friendship. It totally avoid discussing anti-Black racism. But you also have the elite Chinese perspective. Then you have the grassroots perspective. When I say grassroots, I mean those Chinese migrants working in the African market in Guangzhou. They have to do business, rub shoulders with African migrants on a daily basis, right? So for these 2 groups, the elites are mainly, intellectuals, top government officials, professionals, white-collar professionals. They get their knowledge about Africans mainly from media, newspaper, media, even Western media. So what they practice is what I call presumptive racialization. This is based on secondhand knowledge, right? Based on imagination, presumption. They just presume Africans have AIDS, right? Africans are criminals, blah, blah, blah. And so this presumptive racialization is not based on daily life experiences. Well, interactive racialization is based on daily life experiences. However, there are also very, very negative stereotypes and conflicts in this daily life interracial experiences. But at least you can see different groups of Chinese are engaging in different types of racialized practices. Another important point I want to make is we have to go beyond methodological nationalism. Right now, the scholarship on Chinese in Africa and Africans in China, they are more or less divided. You have one group of scholars who study Chinese in Africa, another group study Africans in China. We really have to make a connection between these two, bridge the gap, because these two scholarship share something in common. No, let me rephrase it. The experience of Chinese in Africa and Africans in China share significant similarities and differences. I was in Nigeria for only 3 weeks, but I already discovered there is this illegal problem, illegal Chinese migrants problem in Nigeria is also very serious. And the Chinese government keep it as an open secret. It's also a big headache for the Chinese government, right? So maybe the next step is really to emphasize how the way Africans are treated in China, the racism that they experienced in China is also related to racism against the Chinese in Africa, right? When I was doing research in Guangzhou, when there was a protest against the death of a Nigerian, and some of the Nigerians said, hey, when we go back to our country, we will beat the Chinese, right? And one of the, I forgot when, but there was one incident from the Nigerian state of arresting some Chinese merchants, businessmen there, was widely interpreted as a retaliation of China's immigration control policy. So you see there is both an asymmetrical and symmetrical relation between these two stories of diaspora. Right? So for future scholarship, there must be some way to collect them. So instead of talking about Chinese racism, Western racism, which racism is worst, right? I want to open up the conversation to talk about the epistemological question. How do people form their knowledge? What I call racial knowledge formation theory, right? Where do Chinese people get their knowledge about Blackness is not good, Black people are AIDS carriers, that kind of negative stereotype. So here is a brief list, right? What is indigenous ideas of beauty, right? In traditional Chinese culture, light skin is considered more beautiful. And then you also have Western racial ideology in global media, Hollywood movies. The one Chinese taxi driver told an African-American scholar, he said, I see people like you being chased by the police in the American movies, in Hollywood movies, right? Then you have state immigration policy. I think most of you read my article about how the regulation of the Sanfei population. State policy is colorblind, but the way the policy is implemented is racialized. There are racial profiling when Chinese police officers carry out immigration controls. And also a big part is it comes from rumors and hearsays, right? Presumptive racialization. And lastly, lived experiences. I would say there's still a very small percentage of Chinese who have lived experiences, daily life interactions with African migrants. So what is lacking? What is not there? Anti-racist education programs. I totally agree with Adams, right? China needs anti-racist educational programs. How much time do I still have?
It's okay. You still have a couple minutes, but feel free to.
Okay, I'm jumping to my second part. It's a genealogy of race in China. So I started with the late Qing period, the yellow race lineage discourse. So in the late Qing period, when China sent some students to the UK, they learned evolutionary theory. That was the beginning of the spreading of Western notion of race to China, right? And also Western missionary works. In Dakota's book, he said a Western missionary asked a Chinese little boy, "What color is Chinese?" The little boy said, "Human color." So because he doesn't understand this black-white thing. So the missionary told the little boy, "No, Chinese are yellow," right? So that's a moment when Chinese became racialized as yellow people. However, the late Qing reformers also transformed the meaning of yellow, right? Because within Chinese culture, yellow is the color of the emperor, right? It's royalty, prestige. It reminds you of the Yellow River, also the mythological Yellow Empire, right? It's a total yellow lineage here, right? So the Qing reformers identify themselves as yellow, but it's not the same yellow in the Western sense, right? So they use the word, I translated as yellow race lineage in order to show some indigenous components, right? It's the Chinese idea of lineage based on kinship, based on the same, we are all the descendants of the yellow emperor. It's not exactly the Western notion of race, but it is used as a weapon to fight against white supremacy, right? So it's also a good example of how Western racial categories can get reconfigured in the Chinese context and used for anti-racist purposes. But it's very unfortunate those late Qing scholars, reformers, they only fight against the white supremacy by bringing the yellow race to the same level as the white race. They would say white and yellow are the same. Blacks and red are stupid. So they still perpetuate the racial subordination of Black people. So the yellow race lineage discourse failed to challenge anti-Black racism. Finally, the racial nationalism by Sun Yat-sen, that was the moment when the Chinese nation, the idea of the Chinese nation was developed. Then you have Mao's Third World Alliance. I wouldn't go too much detail into this, but the problem with this Sino-African friendship discourse is it's really asymmetrical. It's really China construct itself as a big brother, right? As how do you say, providing all kinds of help to Africans. So the Mao propaganda actually backfired in post-Mao era. So even ordinary Chinese people in small villages, they understand Africans as being poor, always in need of help, right? So this stereotype, to a large extent, was perpetuated by state propaganda. Then we come to, after China joined the WTO, there's the diversification of foreign population, state regulation of illegal foreigners.
I'm sorry, we're running a bit out of time. Sorry. If you can,
I think I have only one more slide. Right?
Okay.
So, but on the part of the Chinese state, it's still silence and denial of racism, right? Adams talked about the blackface, right, performance. The Chinese state was not doing anything to open up the discussion. All they did was to say, no, we are not racist, right? This actually closed the discussion, right? It muted discussion on race and racism, which is counterproductive, right? This is the last slide. Okay, so more recent development is really, you see Chineseness are being racialized as a racialized identity. With Xi Jinping's the Chinese dream, it's a strong version of racial nationalism with the recent Sino-US trade war and wolf warrior diplomacy, China's vaccine diplomacy. You see a really strong notion of racial nationalism, right? It's Chinese-ness, right? It's racialized in relation to whiteness or in relation to blackness. I will stop here. Thank you. Sorry for going so long.
No, thank you, Professor Lan. It's a very, very interesting presentation. You touched on so many relevant issues, so many of the questions that were raised. Before opening the floor to the audience, I'd like to give a moment for the speakers to react to each other's presentation. They're all very rich, but I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on it. So I think maybe Professor Castillo, you wanted to get started.
Yes, if Professor Bodomo doesn't have anything that he wants to, should I go?
Well, you can go, or he can go. I mean,
I just make a quick remark.
I agree with what you guys say, and
Okay.
I agree with. But my only thing, only thing I like to say is that, China is part of the world body, is part of UN, and the UN and other world bodies fight against racism. So however we see racism, we have to look at it as, I mean, you cannot measure racism in terms of one part of the world is more racist than another part of the world. I mean, victims of racism shouldn't be bothered about these kind of things. So racism is, in my opinion, racism is racism everywhere you find it. And there may be differences in contact with the way, I mean, with the African, the way Africans contacted the Americans or Africans contacted the Chinese. But in the long run, unless we find a way as human beings to live together freely, there is always going to be this issue of race. And there's no point in talking about who is more racist than the other. I don't get myself involved in such kinds of things. I am more concerned about how we can root out this problem so that people can live in peace. I'm a great supporter of Africa-China relations. I want there to be win-win relations between Africa and China. And racism is an impediment, and we shouldn't mince words. It is there. You can analyze it anyhow, but it's always going to be there, and we shouldn't look at. And again, another thing too is that I'm not very convinced about the idea that of importation of Western notions into China. Let's find a way to see racism as a holistic thing. It's a universal problem, and if we look at it that way, we can solve it in a better way than if we looked at it as some part of the world is sending in some other notions, another part of the world. That's my view. Thank you.
I think I'm just gonna be very brief because I know that you wanna open to the floor. So just first, the most important number one is I really appreciated that Professor Bodomo, when he was addressing us in his talk, he highlighted this notion of, he said, the perception of anti-Black racism. And I think that brings nuance to the thing because it's a perception. Rather, even if it's a perception of people or of scholars, it's still a perception, right? So I really thought that was a very good point. Now, I have two quick anecdotes, and then I will just make a final point very briefly. The second one is Professor Shanshan Lan was talking about how there's all this diversity in perceptions of foreignness, right? And how in China, White-Warren is, although there is this diversity, normally White-Warren is kind of related to whiteness, right? When I first came to Hong Kong long time ago, I remember I asked one of my friends here, one of my Cantonese speaking friends here, like, I just said, how do you say, I was coming from Beijing, so I said something like, how do you say White-Warren, or how do you call foreigners here in Cantonese? And then she told me Guailo, right? And maybe she didn't understand my question very clearly. So, and then I assumed, okay, so Guailo is the word for White-Warren or for foreigner in Hong Kong. And then a few days later, I was in another gathering, and I remember I said like, oh yeah, for us, Guailos are, things are like this or that. And they all laughed at me, right? And they were like, oh yeah, you want to be a Guailo, but you're not a Guailo. Look at you, you're not white, right? Then I realized that the association of Guailo was like, they thought that I was trying to pass as white, right? Anyway, obviously, that was a funny incident. But in Hong Kong, there's also this association between foreignness and whiteness. So Professor Lan was definitely on the spot on that. The other thing that I wanted to highlight when Professor Lan spoke about interactive racialization, all these types of racializations that she had there, I think that she mentioned this point. But when we talk about interactive racialization, it goes multidirectionally, right? We hear a lot of very racist comments, if you want, from Chinese people when they describe their interactions sometimes with Africans. But, and this comes from ethnographic work and field work, you hear a lot of really bad things too coming from Africans in China about Chinese people, right? So, that's why I like this idea of interactive racialization, because it's multidirectional, and indeed there's really bad comments there. And the other point, the final one, is this idea that Shanshan was also, sorry for relying on so many of your points, Shanshan, that Shanshan was highlighting, trying to bring together these two fields, right? The Chinese in Africa researchers and the Africans in China researchers, kind of more into conversation, right? And this we're trying to do in the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network. We have tomorrow an event at the same time as this event. I will share the link to the registration of the event a little bit later, but we're going to be talking about the topic of on anti-Black and anti-Chinese sentiments. Now, the funny thing here is that the title of this event is on anti-Black and anti-Chinese sentiments. But originally, my idea was that we often talk about anti-Black racism and anti-Chinese sentiments. And this is not only a choice of words. I think that there's a long history as to why people talk about anti-Chinese sentiment and anti-Black racism. And I find it fascinating that when we bring these fields together, people doing research on race and racism and identity on both sides of this micro universe that we created in Africa-China relations, I think that we need to start perhaps talking about anti-Black and anti-Chinese racisms in the plural, right? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Castillo. Professor Lan, do you want to react to some of these comments, or you want to happy to move on forward?
I have one question for Adams, very short. Adams, how do you define racism? You say racism is racism because there is also the risk of reifying racism.
Well, these are basic 101, lesson 101 kind of things about racism. What I said was that however you define it, from the perspective of whoever is suffering it, it's it's not a pleasant thing. So race, I know you have this problem of, race itself is not a very biological thing. People have said that there's no such thing as race biologically, but it's a social construct. And we cannot deny the fact that it is a social construct. If I wake up now and I start walking, and somebody doesn't like people who look like me, the Black race, and they see me, they will do something for which I will suffer. It is racism. However I deny that I am not of the Black race, I will suffer it. So racism is not something we can, it's from the perspective of the victim, it is any act or any behavior that hurts the person's dignity, the person's feelings, the person's and hurt the person physically. So racism is violence targeted at a certain race, as somebody who looks like a certain race, that kind of social construction. That's what I would say. And in that sense, I don't see a difference between that in America and that in China, or as you say, Chinese in Africa, who also suffer racism. I agree with you. So that's what I would say.
But there is also the danger of privileging, racism against the Black people and making it a universal phenomena. I'm just trying to be provocative, with this Black power movement, and Black people become the default victim of racism, while other groups like Asians in the US were also targets of racial violence at present. And so it's very hard. It's emotionally hard to mention this, but I really want to talk about this. There are some hegemonic ways of talking about race and racism in the academia. How can we, like what Roberto is saying, how can we really bypass or bring in new ways, right? Alternative perspectives, right? To make the discussion more interactive. I'll stop here.
No, I'm not against breaking down this term into, yeah, but maybe I got you. I was mistaken. When I think the idea that at least there's progress in what we've been doing, because many of my colleagues in China that my graduate student who just helped me do this PowerPoint was just telling me that China is not a racist country. As he read through my PowerPoint, and I told her, listen, no country in the world would like to say that they are a racist country, but there's racism everywhere. You can find racism in China, you can find racism in Africa, you can find racism in the West here. So for academic purposes, we can carefully analyze how all these things occur, but from the perspective of the victims of racism, I wouldn't want to sit down on my armchair in my armchair and say, well, there's 40% racism in the US and there's 30% racism in China. It just doesn't help. From the perspective of he who is suffering. And when I talk about victims, I'm not only talking about victims as Blacks, I'm talking about Chinese victims. Look at what happened in the US to Chinese people. I'm talking about people from the Filipino people from other parts who suffer. The Chinese also suffer in Japan, Japanese suffer in China, even Chinese suffer in Hong Kong, So all these kind of things. So we must, in my opinion, we must always look at the victim's perspective of these racist acts. Okay. Thank you.
So, yeah, on that note, talking about Asians in the US and the challenging of racism, we have a question from Clifford Pereira. And they say, Professor Shanshan, you mentioned the importation of Western concepts of race when Chinese students went overseas. Has there been a body of academics who have since challenged those notions? Surely these notions have not stayed in situ.
Can you read the question again? I didn't get.
Yes. So you mentioned that, you mentioned in your presentation that the concept of race were imported from many Chinese students who went overseas. You said, or at least they were important from Western concepts of race. Is there within China, are there academics who are challenging, whatever notion of racism is current in China today? Do you see there a strong body of contestation of dominant ideas of race or racialization, whatever term we choose to adopt?
That's a difficult question, but I want to add something. It's not just from the West, because there are also a group of Chinese students who studied in Japan. Is the Meiji Restoration. Japan was the first country to translate many of the Western theory into Japanese language when they studied in Japan. And they learn, the idea of Minzu, the nation, the idea of nation from Japan. So there were at least two trends. One is students studied in the UK. One is from Japan, right? These two groups of overseas studies coming together. And for the indigenous scholarship, I'm not very familiar because one problem is language. Within the Chinese language, there's no word for race. It's translated as zhong, zhu. Zhong means seed, zhu means lineage. So even when you translate it into Chinese, it's not exactly the same meaning as race in the Western society. But I think there is a new group of scholars in China. One of them is Li Haiyan. She's writing something about this.
All right, thanks. So we have a Binshin who raised her hand. I'm going to promote her to panel so she can quickly ask her question. Binshin, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful panel. It's really great to see people whose work have greatly inspired my thoughts and my own work on this topic, and to see three of you here today. So I have three questions and one for each of the panelists. So first question for Professor Bodomo. You've mentioned that in 2006, there was already a performance of blackface at the summit, China-Africa summit. So do I understand correctly that this is a performance for the African leaders who came to China? And if so, what were the reactions of the audience to this performance? My second question to Professor Castillo, you mentioned, and by the way, I really enjoyed reading your 2020 article. So the question, I actually already had this question when I was reading the article. You mentioned that we have to go beyond the Western terminology, the Western sort of frame of theory. The question is, how do we do that? This is the vocabulary we have. These are the terms that we have, and they're already loaded. And also, today in our world, it's so connected, and everything, all these ideas, we're all consuming them. We're all in it. The Western discursive power is only getting all these things even more influential. So how do we go beyond that? And last question for Professor Lan. It's about what you mentioned about the multiple Chinese gazes, about the difference between the elite and the grassroots. So my question is, if you could also comment a bit on the differences between different regions, different areas in China, because there are places where people, just like what you said about the elite, right? They don't have day-to-day interactions with the Africans. They might also consume the information on the internet, but still they might have a different understanding or different attitudes towards the Africans. In my own research, I've heard repeatedly Africans who said to me that they feel more welcomed in smaller cities or in the countryside in China. So I wondered, what would you say about the regional differences? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Binshin. I think there's plenty to be discussed there. Let's try to make this brief so we're gonna get everyone a chance to ask their questions. But thanks, Binshin. That's great questions. Professor Bodomo, do you want to get started answering her questions?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, that's a perceptive question. To the person who asked the question, I wasn't at the forum myself. I was far away in the US at Stanford University enjoying the California sunshine. So I wasn't in that audience, but I observed it from afar. And what happened was that it was a very sophisticated blackface thing. The Chinese actress or actors would show a Chinese face and then dance, and then turn around, and then you see an African face. You know, they put something at the back, at the back of their heads. They would dance down and turn around, and you see an African. So it was very interesting, you know. The reaction was muted. There was not as much reaction as the 218 and the 221 blackface things. So to answer your question, what do the audience say? I don't know, but what I know is that these were diplomats. I mean, these heads of states and diplomats who attend these things, they hardly say these things in the open. So you wouldn't. There wasn't any substantial outbursts of anger in that conference. But of course, outside, people like me criticize the whole thing, and so that was the beginning of this whole thing. And my comment to this is that at that time, there weren't that many Africans in China or weren't aware of these kind of communities that have developed now. And I think that in future, the Chinese who do these things, organizations who do these festivals, can easily get Black people to join them. It's not a very difficult thing, you know. Just do it and join them, and you can collaborate even better that way than doing something that people criticize you and you keep doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Pinsing, thanks for the difficult question. Definitely, that was something that I attempt to engage with in that article that you quoted, and that I personally believe that I somehow didn't have the time to get at in a very in a deeper way, right? I kind of left it for the end. So the question is, how do we go beyond the West, right? That's such a difficult question as how do we escape Western modernity, right? Like, is there a way out? But I would kind of like to frame this in with an optimistic tone, in the sense that I think that we have to do this step by step, right? Especially people who are doing research. We are producing knowledge, right? And we do not need to conform, we do not need to connect with the literature, right? We can slowly start trying to change the discussions, the debates, the way we speak about things, right? I mean, the main issue that I have always had, and people in the room know this issue that I have had, is with the notion of migrants, for instance, right? Or framing Africans in China as migrants. And I spoke about that in the article. So I think that we definitely try to strive to kind of articulate an anti-imperial vocabulary of race and racism that is anti-hegemonic. I know this sounds a little bit like, these good intentions from the progressive left, right? But I think it can be done in terms of knowledge production if we convince ourselves that we do not need always to just repeat and regurgitate some of the concepts and notions that are given to us from a global north influence academia. And we start fighting against those reductionisms that are produced in this kind of paradigmatic centers of knowledge production that we all look for as if they were like, the beacons of light. I think that we can produce very important scholarship and start changing the conversation from even positions that are not the hegemonic positions in hegemonic universities, in paradigmatic centers. And just to finalize this comment, one of the reasons why I am in Hong Kong and I'm doing cultural studies where I'm doing cultural studies is because the place where I'm working belongs to a very interesting network in Asia that is called Inter-Asia or Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. And one of the main ideas of this network of Asian scholars and thinkers and practitioners is to start creating knowledge from Asia about Asia and the world. And they have this notion that they call interreferencing, right? That you do not have to, if you're doing your dissertation or writing about race and racism and power, you do not have to go and quote, I don't know, like Theo Goldberg and Foucault and all these French people and Americans that do racial theory, because there are people working on theory and race and racism and identity and nationalism in Asia, producing work in many ways like Shanshan from the ground, right? So you don't need to go and look for this kind of like white scholars with like white beards and looking very authoritative, right? Sorry, I'm getting carried away. I'm going to stop there.
Good to have some emotion. It's good to mix it more entertaining. Professor Lan, you want to answer the question?
Yeah, I'm just joking, but Lan Shanshan was also educated in the US. Right?
I know, but being educated in the US does not mean that you cannot go against that, right? I mean,
right.
I don't know, Stuart Hall was educated in the UK, right? But look what he did, right?
Okay, and my question.
Vincent doesn't tell the people at Sciences Po not to cite the French speakers. The French we can censor that part of the conversation.
You can dismantle the master's house with the master's tool. You can still learn Western theory in order to deconstruct it.
Yeah, the problem is when you start reproducing that Western theory without questioning it, and just because that's what we have, right?
Yeah, perhaps it's related to this idea of immanent critique, right? This idea of, I think that's what people are hinting at, but it's definitely some very, very interesting discussions there to be had, and very, very high level, important epistemological issues there. Professor Lan, I wasn't sure if you wanted to answer Vincent's questions or
very briefly. I agree with you. In smaller cities, even in rural areas, Africans are more welcomed because it's their foreignness that sticks out. It's not their blackness. It might be the first time those villagers see a foreigner, right? So they just, I didn't really do a lot of the spatial dimension in my African projects, but now with this wideness in China, I'm trying to do multi-scalar analysis. I try to go to smaller cities, but it's an ongoing project. But that's a great question. Can I say a little bit about the blackface thing?
Of course.
I think the performance at the FORCAC summit was intended to be a gesture to please African guests. Even the New Year Gala was also a friendly, quote unquote, a friendly gesture to honor our, African brothers. But the Chinese did it in the wrong way, right? Because of their cultural ignorance. But another important thing, also historical context, this blackface performance actually originated from the Mao era. The Mao era, the performers, I watched the video online, the performers performed the blackface to Chinese audience. And they sing a song. The song is, look how much our Black African brothers are suffering from imperialism, from colonialism. So we should stand by their side. We should fight for them. So that performance has its anti-colonial propaganda or agenda there. So it's a totally different historical tradition, but very few people talk about that tradition. And people often mix up this Chinese version and the Western version and say it's the same thing. Anytime there is this blackface performance, someone will jump out and say, hey, this is racist. But it also shows a hegemonic interpretation of blackface performance. Is there another way for blackface performance to be appropriated, in a specific local context for a different purpose? There are some literature on blackface performance in Japan. So the author asked this girl, I said, why do you wear this afro? Why do you paint your face black? The girl said, because it's cool, it's in fashion. Everybody's doing it. It has nothing to do with anti-Black racism, and they don't care about the Black minstrel history in the US.
Look,
Sunshine,
if I can come in.
Yeah,
the thing is, blackface is damaged goods. That's my advice. Blackface is damaged goods. In this, any attempt to say that you can use it for, the best solution I have proposed is use Black people. And at the same time, I would say to Africans when they want to imitate Chinese, if Chinese are in Africa and you want to you have to have Chinese actors, use them. That's the best way. But to try to say that, the way the Chinese do it is different from the way the Americans do it, it just wouldn't catch. I mean, it wouldn't do.
Could I just quickly
one of the people
intervene there, Adams? Sorry.
One of the people who fought against this thing was a young student group in Beijing called Black Levity. They wrote against this. So my point is that if you do something in an attempt to raise somebody or to praise somebody or to bring up somebody's value, and the person says, no, this is not the way to do it, you drop it. Blackface is damaged goods. That's my advice. I like the relation between Africa and China to increase, but I think that the best way is not do something that people don't like, just find other ways to do it. That's my opinion.
Could I just quickly jump in?
Mm-hmm.
Adams, I think that someone from Black Liberty, I think Runako is in the.
Yeah, that's one. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so just quickly, because I mean, we have had these discussions before, either through our papers or in different events that we've been together. And I definitely identify with what Adams is saying, but I'm also a little bit on the side of Shanshan in this sense. And I'm not trying to oppose them, right? But one thing that I was discussing yesterday, because I was in a panel yesterday night talking about race and media representations of China-Africa relations historically, right? And one of the students was asking me this question: can you compare the blackface in the CCTV gala, the one that Adams presented, the one from 2018? Can you compare that kind of blackface that was presented in a comedic way to kind of mock Blackness or Africanness or whatever, as we saw, and we know that is what it was, And in that way, it resembles more the minstrelsy kind of blackface that we know. Can you compare that type of blackface with the blackfaces that emerged in the 1960s in China, in the revolutionary days of the Cultural Revolution, in the theatrical plays that were presenting China as a, you know, the Xiongdi or the brothers in the revolution struggling against imperialism and so on and so forth, where there are a number, and we also have, I think Kong Huang is in the audience, so she's kind of an expert in that. So there were also this kind of blackening of the skin of performers. However, when you actually look at the context and the ideological context and the purposes that the representations and the performance had, I'm not saying anything here, but I'm just saying that they seem to serve different ideological purposes. And so the student was kind of hinting at the fact that she kind of believed that what was happening in the 60s, although performatively speaking, is indeed the blackening of the skin of an actor to pass as a black. She was trying to ask me by suggesting that that was different to what this lady Lo Nai-Ming was doing in the CCTV gala. I just want to leave that there. We don't need to debate that, but I think talking about context, then you also need to think about the ideological context. Is every single time where someone darkens their skin a black face, right? Or how does that? Or a yellow face when anybody else does something to look like Chinese, right? Historically speaking.
Yeah, interesting question there on whether these practices should be always contextualized, or there are some global limits to what can be contextualized or not, right? Thanks. Maybe let's move on to some of the other questions by the audience. A very good conversation. It's good, always good to inspire passion from all sides. And so we're talking, and that's another thing that was raised by Professor Lan. So Gish, sorry, apologies for mispronunciation. Chen is asking that the term, how do we define racialism? The term is not confined to anti-Black, it seems. Nowadays, Chinese netizens also speak of white leftists, I don't know how to pronounce it, Baizuo, to refer to those whites with ignorance of reality, in quotes. I'm sure you all know of that. So isn't any denigration of white leftists also a phenomenon of racism? So I think we brought the question of what it was mentioned that usually racism is thought of racism against Africans, and China is against the Chinese is anti-Chinese sentiment. And I think now we're hitting perhaps even more delicate questions. Can you be racist against whites? So would like to hear some of the opinions of some of the panelists. In this case, white leftists, if that can be considered a racism from the Chinese.
Well, according to the American alt-right, they are the victims of discrimination. So I guess that, yeah, they could be suffering. White people, a lot of people are suffering. White people are suffering in different parts of the world now. Sorry, I don't know. Ge Cheng got the question right in there because he or she, I don't know. Sorry, I was asking how do we define racialism, and I think that no one has spoken about racialism here, which is also a concept. So we've been talking about racialization and racism mostly. So racialism is kind of another story that I don't think we have time to address. So I think you would have to clear that out, Ge Cheng. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I want to make any comments on the Baizuo and how the Baizuo are represented in China.
Anyone else? Any other the guests you want to talk about this this phenomenon of? I'm not familiar with it, so I can't precise, but I don't know if you.
I also don't know anything about the white leftists, but I want to comment on some white people because I'm studying white Westerners in China now. Some of them claim they are being discriminated. You know, there's the term positive racism, right? They are discriminated in a more positive way. So I personally think there is a qualitative difference between the way Blacks are treated and the way white people are treated. So white people enjoy a lot of privileges. But some of the inconvenience, even the discrimination they experienced, is because of their foreigner status. because of their status as a migrant. Because the majority of white people refuse to consider they are migrants. They use the term expat, transnational elites, right?
Yes.
Even to apply the migration framework to them is already a revolution, right? So I would argue those positive racism argument is untenable because it's blind to the persistence of white privilege in China. That's it.
Yeah, it's just that when you say that some whites in Asia and in China enjoy privileges, sometimes they don't see themselves as enjoying them, and sometimes they're just complaining and having this cultural shock and thinking that that cultural shock is some form of racism and discrimination against them, which they just cannot see beyond the fact that it is not that, right? So you do get a lot of white people in Asia that come here and they start feeling mistreated somehow, and then they start feeling minoritized, and then they start saying that like they are discriminated, the victims of racism, and that China is now their global north, and that they are, you know, the expats that are mistreated from kind of a global. A lot of people saying things.
Yeah, that sounds a bit crazy, for the lack of a better term.
I mean, if I can just say a few on this question of whether whites can also be victims of race, I believe so. I mean, in my opening remarks, I said that the people who get the brunt of this are blacks, you know, yellow and brown people, but whites can also be victims of racism, of discrimination against them. I mean, and the case of South Africa, I mean, South African whites after the apartheid, I mean, after the down of apartheid, when they lost their privileges, many of them now started saying that they were being discriminated against, especially with the black empowerment measures and all those kind of things. So yes, it is possible that in some parts of the world, whites can be discriminated against by, and we could even begin to see it as things go, as the economies of countries rise. You know, you might see cases in which whites who are immigrants in those countries will also feel discriminated against. So it's not just only the black.
Yeah, well, but
white,
I think that part of the point is about, like, you know, one thing is discrimination, and like maybe, I don't know, some Americans, white Americans that come to Asia can feel discriminated, or, you know, for an example. But and then this is one of the points that I'm always a little bit contentious with Shanshan, but now I think we're getting closer. In the sense of, like, when we talk about systemic racism, right? I know that in the West and in the UK and in the US, this is obviously, everybody talks about this now, especially in academic circles. But one thing is to be discriminated by whomever. Someone tells you they don't like you because you're an American in China. But one other thing is to be the victim of, as Professor Bodomo was saying, of the brunt of a systemic practice that by the way, I do not believe that there's a systemic practice emerging against Africans in China, but that's another story that I have with Shanshan, right? But indeed, I think that generally speaking, globally speaking, we need to make that distinction between, you know, I don't like you myself because where you're from, or I have a whole legal system that is there to oppress you. Right? I think the difference is very strong, right?
Yeah, thank you. So unfortunately, we need to come to an end soon. Let's just, you know, from a more, I think it's nice to end Derek Sheridan's question, which is more forward-looking, because Professor Bodomo and both Professor Lan mentioned the need for race education and anti-racist education in China. So he's asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on what could look in a Chinese context. Would it be more like an American liberal, quote unquote, anti-racist education, like against skin color prejudice, or drawing on more critical approaches to race, such as structural racism and privilege? So, and she's asking, it's a very extensive question, but also asking what kind of pedagogy may be appropriate. And also, if you also think about the Han, non-Han, ethnic minority issue.
Well, hopefully China never takes the US as an example, because there's no higher moral ground whatsoever. But anyway, sorry, it's not a question for me.
No, I think all the panelists are, I think it's he drew on what the Professor Bodomo and Lan was saying, but all the panelists are welcome to contribute. So, but yeah, please, maybe starting. Bodomo, yeah.
I have one concrete suggestion about racial education. I mean, the curriculum should be one place one can start with. For one thing, China has to stop profiling people. And my example is from Hong Kong. You know, in Hong Kong, there was a textbook in which there were different kinds of people with different pictures. You had Filipinos and Japanese and blacks. And for the Filipinos, they said, this is how your domestic helper looks like. For the Japanese, this is how it looks like. This is shopkeeper. And they had all these kinds of things. This is a typical example of racial profiling that if a child grows up with, they would always see a Filipina as a domestic helper. So it is called racial profiling. So one thing China can do concretely in its education, in its curricular improvement, is to stop this kind of thing, or to not present textbooks like this, you know, or to present people as they are, and not put them as people. If you can say that here is an illegal immigrant and you have a black man, then of course the child is going to grow up seeing black men as criminals, you know. So these are just concrete things. I mean, of course, I'm not in the curriculum committee, but the Chinese can sit down and come up, whether China likes it or not. It is now the second largest economy in the world. Whether it likes it or not, it will have a lot more people of different background, race, and skin color coming to China. And the educational system has to tackle this. That's one concrete suggestion I have. Stop profiling people. And one example too is something I suffer every day every time when I go to China. You will see a long line of people at the immigration place, and then they would check you. When it comes to me, the black person, they will do extra check. They will send you aside and check you more clearly. That's a clear case of racial profiling at the immigration office. I wrote about this, and also at the customs office and customs place. So China can begin, or Beijing, or everybody, all stakeholders can begin to look at things this way, that China is going to be a multi-racial society, whether we like it or not, and we have to find ways of raising racial awareness and racial awareness against racism in China. Thank you.
Could I just quickly mention something I find very interesting from what Professor Bodomo is saying? Yes. I don't have it here with me, but I remember that once I saw this like a pyramid kind of image of that was depicting the racial prejudice in Hong Kong, right? And like who were the groups that were at the bottom and who were more discriminated and whatever. And I remember, I think this came from the South China Morning Post maybe 10 years ago or something like that. But they, in other countries, the groups, like in the West, the groups that get the brunt of the racialization and the racist practices, at the bottom were normally the Africans or the black people, right? Like the ones that were suffering the most. But in Hong Kong, it's really interesting to see that that Africans are not at the bottom, right? They were just like one level above, and Indians were at the bottom, right? Or brown men, or whatever you want to call people like Indians. So I just want to highlight that, like, as a brown, because it's very interesting what Professor Bodomo was saying of his experience, but as a brown male, I have always found, who has lived both in China and in Hong Kong, I have always found it way more difficult to experience Hong Kong as a brown body than in China, right? Obviously, the difference may be related to this pyramid in which, like, brown skinned men looking like Indians or whatever are more discriminated in Hong Kong than in China, right? And the other thing associated with that, quickly, so Shanshan can address the question by Derek, is that at some point I remember that when I was starting my research in Guangzhou so many years ago, I was asking every single African that I was meeting in the city, I was asking them, how difficult is it to be an African in China? Because that's one of the questions that is there in, in the narrative and in media, right? And, some people would tell me things, yeah, it's, easy, difficult, whatever. But one guy really struck me, and I will never forget him. He told me, like, you're asking me how difficult it is to be a black in China? I have lived in France. Go to France, and you would learn about what is it difficult to be a black man or a black body. Here is nothing, right? So, you know, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. A very, very interesting personal. I think the personal perspective really highlights some of these very relevant issues. Professor Lan, perhaps to conclude, since we've run out of time.
I think China has to get over first its ethnocentrism, because the Chinese state is very good at, you know, doing this so-called patriotic education. We are the best. We have the longest history. Really has to move beyond this ethnocentrism to realize there are other groups in the world whose history we have to know, especially the history of slavery, civil rights movement, Black Power movement, and just to look at China's reaction to the Black Lives Matters movement. There's nothing in China really, you know, try to show support. China was happy to say, hey, US, you are having this mess, right? You deal with it. So China totally placed itself outside this global anti-racist movement, which is hugely problematic. Another thing is really to educate about there are different types of racism. Right? Racism is not just personal attitude, bad language, I beat you up. It's more systematic. It's embedded in the system. It's also epistemological. Right? Our textbook, you know, how we read the newspaper, everyday life. It's a long, very difficult task. I hope that the Chinese government will realize the importance, because as China is getting more diverse, there will be more racial issues coming up. Sooner or later, it has to deal with it. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's very nice to end on a note of agreement after some very exciting discussions that we had throughout the talk. I'd like to thank again all the guests for having made the time. I know it's not easy to coordinate against so many different time zones and continents. I'd like to make the panelists for having made the time to participate in this panel. Thanks to all the attendees. It was a pleasure. Let me mention again Professor Castillo's event that's happening tomorrow on anti-Black and anti-Chinese sentiments. You see the link of the Eventbrite link in the chat box in case you're interested. That should be very, very interesting, continuing the conversation that happened today. And again, thank you very much. And please follow our social media and websites to keep posted on our next events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for doing this.
Bye-bye. See you guys.